Hello and welcome to another Ask the Expert with Genus. And today we've got Dr. Carolyn Orr. Dr. Carolyn, thank you very much for joining us. Why don't you tell us what you do, who you are?
Well, hi there. I'm a neurologist, a specialist in brain disease, and my particular interest is dementia, which is chronic brain failure. I'm from Scotland originally, in case you're wondering about the accent, and I've worked in various countries. About 20 years ago, I ended up in Sydney, and I spent a long time there before moving across to Western Australia about 6 years ago, where I've been ever since.
Great.
And out here, I work as a medical specialist. I teach, I do clinical care, and I run clinical research into brain diseases. That's my day job. I'm also a mother of two. I've got two primary school age children who are my pride and my joy and my hope for the future.
Excellent. So aside from being a medical doctor, you're also quite vocal and active in climate space and fossil fuel space. And tell us a little bit about that.
Well, I wasn't always, John. Going back a few years ago, I didn't know anything about this stuff. And then in about 2018, I read an article in a newspaper called The Guardian. And that article, and I do remember it quite clearly, it said that since 1970, 60% of all the animal life on this planet has been destroyed. And I read it and I thought, that can't be right. There's got to be a mistake in there. So I read the article and then I followed down to the primary sources, which was a World Wildlife Fund report. And I couldn't get it out of my head. And I had never been the kind of person that clicked on or read environmental type articles. But I suddenly started doing so because I think I wanted to disprove to myself what I was worried about. And I started reading about things like climate change and biodiversity or species loss and pollution. And without realizing it, I started educating myself in what was going on in our world today. And it was a real education. This was stuff I just didn't know was happening. And although that was kind of an unconscious process, what was conscious was the choice to step into it, to not turn my head away. That was a choice that I made to learn and find out about this. And over time, I started to get the feeling that someone really had to be doing something about this. And over time, I found myself becoming that person.
That's such an inspiring story. Number one, starting from a place of awareness and education,
Ignorance at the beginning.
Brilliant, brilliant. So listen, there's a lot of talk about climate change in the media at the moment, a huge amount of coverage about it. You mentioned The Guardian, they're particularly kind of visible in that space. And it no longer seems to be a case of do you believe in it, but more a case of do you understand it, right? So why don't you tell us what you think climate change means?
Sure. Well, this amazing planet of ours has an atmosphere around it, and in that atmosphere are greenhouse gases. So that's things like carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide. And this is a natural phenomenon, and we need these because if we didn't have them, this planet of ours would be as cold as a freezer or a meat locker. And we call this the natural greenhouse effect. So what happens is those gases trap heat that comes from the sun, and it keeps us in the Goldilocks zone, so not too cold, not too hot, just perfect. And it's a bit like having a doughnut on your bed. It keeps you nice and toasty. This has been the case for all of humanity, and it's allowed life to develop on this earth. Now, the problem is that since the Industrial Revolution, so say about 200 years ago, humans started adding extra greenhouse gases to the atmosphere. And inevitably what's been happening over time is that the planet has been warming up because we're increasing that effect. And this is not at all natural. This is all on us. And it's like throwing an extra doona on your bed. You get a bit warmer and then goes on a third doona and a fourth doona and a fifth doona. And suddenly it's starting to get really hot in here and really uncomfortable. And this is kind of the equivalent of what we're doing. We're heating the planet up by trapping heat in the planet that should be dissipating off into space. And we're losing that Goldilocks effect that we've had for all of humanity's history. We're pushing the planet out of the Goldilocks zone. So far, we've heated the planet up just over 1 degree Celsius, and that doesn't sound a lot, does it? 1 degree Celsius, well, you wouldn't even notice that on a typical day. But in fact, this is having absolutely drastic effects already in our planet, because what it's doing is in the sea, it's causing the poles, so the Arctic and the Antarctic are melting. And that's causing sea level to rise slowly, but it's gaining pace. And then on land, glaciers are melting, and this is the source of water for lots of human beings. We're seeing heat waves that we've never seen before, and it's driving extreme weather events. So it's potentiating things like floods and droughts and cyclones. And ultimately, it's going to compromise water and food security for humanity. So it's really having terrible effects on our agriculture and our ecosystems. And for example, the Great Barrier Reef is now suffering its 6th mass bleaching event, and we're going to lose the Great Barrier Reef within the generation if we continue what we're doing. Now, this all seems really theoretical and boring. A lot of people don't care about the environment. I didn't consider myself a greenie up until, a few years ago, but in fact, this has massive impacts on people because we depend on, a safe water supply, stable agriculture, and we're pushing ourselves away from humanity's Goldilocks zone and what we're doing. They do say if you're in a hole, we've got to stop digging, and we've got to stop adding more greenhouse gas emissions to the atmosphere, or the other term that gets used is carbon emissions. We've got to stop pushing carbon emissions into our atmosphere.
So this is the main driver, right? So climate change, as you said, sounds very abstract and very long term, and people are able to kind of disassociate because of that, right? But this is a very practical thing that's happening, and it's a very practical cause and effect link, right? So what's really driving it? You've mentioned things like industrial revolution and greenhouse gases and fossil fuels and that. What's going on?
All right. Unquestionably, the main cause of climate change is fossil fuels. Now, what are fossil fuels? There are 3 fossil fuels. The first is coal, and coal is the oldest and the dirtiest fossil fuel by far. Mm-hmm. And then there's oil, which is actually just the petrol that we use to drive our cars. It's what drives our transport. And the third is gas, otherwise known as natural gas, or in this country, LNG, liquefied natural gas. And in many of our houses, that's the source of our heating and our cooking. And these 3 fossil fuels, coal, oil, and gas, by burning them, we're releasing carbon or greenhouse gas emissions, and this is what's heating up our atmosphere. Now, there are other sources of global heating as well. So, for example, agriculture, beef farming, deforestation, forests and trees. If you remember your basic science, trees, through photosynthesis, take carbon dioxide and make oxygen. They're the lungs of the planet, and we're deforesting the planet at an absolutely appalling rate to make our cities and our suburbs and our farms. So there are other issues going on as well, but we have to name and focus on the biggest problem, which is fossil fuels, because if we don't tackle that one, we've got no chance of getting out of this.
Yep, that sounds very familiar. And you did a TEDx UWA talk that I had the pleasure of seeing. It's incredible and inspiring.
I'm really proud to be the first doctor to call out fossil fuels on a TEDx platform.
It's amazing. And the argument you make is that there is a direct link between the use of fossil fuels and a negative impact on public health, right?
Yeah, and public health doctors have known this for a long time, and it's not just the link between fossil fuels and climate change, because fossil fuels are also the cause of one of the biggest problems that you've never heard of or thought much about, which is air pollution. Now, air pollution literally is invisible toxins in our air that we breathe in through our lungs and take through our body, but it's actually the 3rd biggest cause of disease in human beings.
Wow.
And this is, as I said, it's not something we think about much, but here's a statistic that's going to completely blow you away. 1 in 5 human beings dies because of air pollution caused by fossil fuels. 1 in 5. That just completely blows me away.
And is that everywhere, or is that centralized in certain parts?
No, that is an average statistic throughout the whole planet. So if looking at it another way, the average human being loses 13 months of life to the pollution that comes from fossil fuels. Now, you're right, some areas are affected worse than others. If you're in India or in China, you're going to be a bit worse affected than in Australia, but it's absolutely an Australian problem as well, because air pollution, doesn't know any barriers, So if it's created in one country, it's going to drift across to another. So what's created somewhere, we all get a share of in the end.
Incredible. And so, I mean, it's very, very clear that this is happening. There's scientific evidence to prove it, and data to back it up. We've interviewed a climate scientist, with Genus before, and the data's there for everyone to see. So we need to stop it. We know that much.
Yeah, it's not just early death that fossil fuels are causing. It's also air pollution is causing. It's also human health. If you look at children who are exposed to air pollution have smaller lungs. They have a worse IQ, so they're actually stupider than children not exposed to air pollution. They have a higher risk of childhood cancer, including things like leukemia, and they have more asthma and other childhood disease. In adults, now I'm an adult doctor, in adults it's almost easier to think about illnesses. There's so many illnesses that are caused by air pollution. It's very hard to think of any that aren't. Cancer, heart disease, diabetes, osteoporosis, emphysema, kidney disease, liver disease, hell, even skin disease. Did you know there's a fairly tight link between acne and air pollution? Like this stuff just amazes you. Fertility is impacted by air pollution. Women affected by air pollution are more likely to miscarry, have smaller babies, have babies born too early, and these are really big deals health-wise. And then I'm a neurologist, a brain doctor. About 20% of the strokes, so brain attacks that I see, are driven by air pollution, and a significant fraction of dementia as well, which is now the leading cause of death for women in Australia. So this is a huge cause of human illness, and there's no safe limit for most pollutants.
That's incredible. I mean, it's unconscionable that we're not doing more about it as a society. So what can we do? How are we dealing with this at the moment? Is it enough? How do we do more?
Okay. Well, the good news is that society is finally really starting to step up on this one, and it's really all being driven by education. When I was a kid, I don't remember learning anything really about anything environmental in school or at university. We didn't talk about it in hospitals as a young doctor, but my kids have been talking about environmental matters since they were in nursery and in kindy, and now as primary schoolers, they're constantly coming back. They'll tell me about things like greenhouse gases, they'll tell me about worm farming, they'll tell me about recycling. So this is being driven by primary schools. If you look at secondary schools, for example, the Fridays for Future or the school striker movement, this is being driven by secondary school students, and they have incredible moral authority. And then if you look at universities, same sort of thing. A lot of university students are really concerned about this. So education, people are learning about this and suddenly waking up to the fact that climate change is huge, massive and real, and that we need to urgently do something about it. And also that it's not just the greatest threat we've ever faced down as a species, it's our greatest opportunity. If we tackle climate change and fossil fuels, we'll not only save the planet and save our future and our children's future, we're going to dramatically drop human illness. 1 in 5 human deaths, IQ, longer, healthier lives, they're all there for the taking, if we go aggressively enough against climate change and the causes of climate change, which are fossil fuels.
Yeah, and it's interesting you say, the education sector is stepping up, and that's probably the precursor to significant societal change, isn't it? And it reinforces how you started, this conversation. And I suppose it's also a validation for the Genus model. It starts with education and critical thinking. So I think, yeah, you're absolutely right. What do you think are the practical barriers, to action on climate change?
All right, so I'm going to call out the real villain of the piece here, because scientists have known since at least the 1980s, possibly as far back as the 1960s, that climate change has been caused by fossil fuels. So here's a question for you. Why have we not been doing something about this much, much earlier? The reason is that for decades, the problem of climate change has been obscured by fossil fuel companies and their lobbyists. They have spent millions over many decades now doing what I call the 5 Ds of the fossil fuel companies. Can I take you through the 5 Ds?
Please.
So first of all, denial. Now, you like me have a few years on the clock, if it's okay to say that, Jon. You and I know that we have spent decades arguing about whether or not climate change was real. This was insane. The science has been settled since the 1980s. But fossil fuel companies were paying for bad science and rogue scientists to trot out contrary research when practically all the world's scientists were saying this is real, this is a thing, we've got to do something about it. So denial has been a big thing. And then for a while there was disinformation, and for a few years there we were arguing about whether we stopped arguing about whether or not climate change was real. The evidence was just stacking up too much, and we started arguing about whether or not climate change was caused by something that humans were doing it, or whether it was just a natural fluctuation in the planet. Again, that doesn't fly anymore. The jig is up. Then denigration. So a lot of negative talk about environmental activists, climate activists and environmental scientists, people that have been doing good work for a long period of time, have had to sort of wear the mantle of, the sandal wearing hippie, not a real person, not worth listening to, just listen to the business people, and this is nonsense. So, but none of that is really working anymore. So they're onto two strategies, and one of them is delusion. And that delusion is particularly prominent here in Australia. That is technology we are about to invent is going to come along at the last minute and save us. Now, that might work in a Hollywood film, but it's just not working in real life. And I'm going to call it things like carbon capture here. This is not something that's going to save us. It's being spiked aggressively, and it's fantasy. And we've got to get off fossil fuels. But above all, the mother of all of this is delay, 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 putting off till tomorrow what we urgently need to do today. And this is, the history of this is amazing, because it's the same kind of disregard for human suffering that allowed the tobacco companies to delay action on cancer for decades. It's the same disregard for human suffering that allowed slavery to go on decades after people were calling this out. And again, with every year of delay, the fossil fuel companies and their investors make more profits, but the human suffering that we are creating is immense, and we need to call this out. They are spending millions of dollars each year to delay climate action and climate policy. So I'm calling out fossil fuel companies as the villain of the piece here.
I fully agree, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the biggest single contingent at COP26 was a fossil fuel lobby group, right?
That's right.
Bigger than any single government or anything.
Yeah, so and isn't that crazy? So the body that is supposed to protect us from the ravages of climate change are completely infiltrated by fossil fuel companies and their lobbyists, and this has been the case since the inception of these climate conferences. And it's the same with our government, both at national and state level here in Australia. The fossil fuel companies have absolutely outsized influence, and we have got to, if we don't tackle this, we're in real trouble.
Sounds crazy when you say, the government is, I think, subsidizing fossil fuel as an industry more than they're protecting the barrier reef.
Yeah. Remember what I said about how if you're in a hole, you've got to stop digging. We've got to stop throwing public money at fossil fuel companies while we starve renewables of the money they need to get up and get going.
Interesting, with an election just around the corner, right? So let's pull it back to our key audience, the young people. What can they do? What would you say to them, I suppose, firstly, if they're worried about climate change and the environment, and what can they do to start changing things? Okay,
well, first of all, I'm going to say well done for not looking away and for not stepping back. Now, Jon, you and I will, and I hope the younger audience is familiar with this, is a movie going back about 20 years called The Matrix. And there's a character called Neo, and Neo gets the choice of taking the blue pill or the red pill, and the blue pill keeps him in his pleasant reality that he sort of knows is not quite right, and the red pill takes him to see reality as it is, and it's not so pleasant, and it's tough, and it's really challenging, but he chooses to take the red pill and face reality and to step up and to become a hero. And I think people that face the challenge of our environment and fossil fuel companies and the climate crisis are modern day heroes. So first of all, well done for stepping up. You are the heroes that we need just now. The second I would say is, I know you're afraid. I know you're anxious. I know you're angry, and I know you're depressed about this. But the antidote to all of that is action. It's doing something about this, and that's going to make you feel powerful, make you friends that you never realized that you were going to have, and it's going to be a real antidote to everything that you feel. So have courage and know your place in history. You are the same kind of people that stood against slavery, the same kind of people that got votes for women, civil rights for Black people, self-determination in India, and fight for rights for Aboriginals here in Australia. And you can do this. So what I challenge you to do, think about what we need Think about what you're good at and what you like, and where that nexus is, that's where you should be. For example, I'm a medical doctor. All medical doctors, if they're worth their salt, should be good communicators. So I got to talk about this and spread the message, and particularly spread the message from a health point of view. Now, if you're technical or scientific or a good designer, you need to figure out technical solutions for the climate crisis. You need to figure out the technologies that are going to help us, because we do need them. And if you have courage and stamina, then I challenge you to get into politics, because we need good, moral, ethical people standing up, challenging our current crop of politicians.
That's an interesting idea in itself, isn't it? Honest and courageous politicians. But
oh, I know.
What can they do? What do you do on a practical level, day to day, to live more sustainably? It's great to have these lofty goals and these long horizons, and I think that's absolutely critical, especially when we're talking, to the next generation. But on a day-to-day level, what do you do to live more sustainably?
Sure. So first up, the first thing I did was actually look at my money. Now, I know if you're a young person, you probably don't have much of that, but think about things like banks and superannuation and mortgages and so on. Almost all of our big financial institutions are the banks and the funders of the fossil fuel industry. There is a terrific website called marketforces.org. And if you type in the name of your bank or your mortgage holder or your superannuation company, it will tell you if they're invested in fossil fuels, and if they are, move your money. Now, if you're a young person, listen to this, talk to your mum and dad about this, find out who they're with, Google that information and present them with hard information, and then put the emotional heavy on them, because we need to all be moving our money out of fossil fuels. Then think about transport. So I'm in my 40s. In my eternal quest to remain that bit more cylindrical and a bit less spherical, I've taken up cycling, because it's good for the environment as well as my health. So I cycle to work most days. My petrol car is about to get swapped out from an electric car, which will be run off our solar house. And this one's really painful, and I'm flying a lot less than I used to. So I don't fly for medical conferences anymore at all. I will still fly. I'm from Scotland. I will still go home and see my mother sometimes, but I do not fly for holidays. I'm trying to really cut that back, because it's such a big deal. Diet-wise, I'm eating a hell of a lot more vegetarian than I used to, because vegetarian diets are healthier for us. That, we know this now, rather than meat-based diet, and I'm steering well away from beef, because we know that cattle are such a disaster environmentally. I speak out, and the last thing, of course, is your vote. Absolutely, you can't vote for anyone, who doesn't take climate change and environmental health really seriously. We're way past all of that now. Not all political parties are the same. There are some amazing independents stepping up on this issue. So I urge you, think very seriously about who you give your vote to these days.
Excellent. One final question. We come to the IPCC report recently, and it was, it's quite dark reading to start off with, and it talks about the fact that, the rate of change is accelerating and things like that. But it finishes by saying it's not too late. The technologies that we need exist already. The will is what we need to turn things around. The political will, the social will. Do you agree? Can we turn this around?
Absolutely. And in fact, the third part of that report was published just today, and I was reading it before we spoke. So essentially what they're saying is it's an absolutely enormous job, but it can be done, and it's affordable. It's a huge job, but we have to start right now. We cannot keep kicking this off into the future. Delay, we don't win, but if we tackle this right now with the transformational change that it merits, then we can do this. So we've absolutely got to get ourselves off fossil fuels as a society. And this is not just for, this is not just for energy companies or for transport or for farming or for industry or for schools or for hospitals or for homes. This is all of us working together. But if we pull together, we can do this. Hope is not dead. We are actually probably the most important people that have ever lived, because how we choose to act this decade is going to determine the future of the rest of humanity. That's a hell of a responsibility. And not only that, this is not a shared responsibility throughout all the humans currently alive today. I live in a Western democratic country where I have a voice and I have a say. I am not a child in Bangladesh. I am not a poor subsistence farmer in Africa. I have a say, and so does everyone else that is lucky enough to be listening to this. We need to use that privilege and use our voice. I think it was Spider-Man that says, with great power comes with great power comes great responsibility. We have that power and we have that responsibility.
And it's a privilege, as you said, we do live in a very well-developed country, a democratic and a free country, but I feel like we're underperforming. How is Australia doing compared to other countries, do you think?
All right. Well, let's cut through all the spin and the greenwashing. Last year, Australia was ranked the worst country in the world by the United Nations for action on climate change. We were at the bottom of 130 odd countries. So all the spin and the nonsense that you're reading about officially, be aware that that's exactly what it is. We're way behind other developed countries in terms of transitioning to renewable energy. We drive the dirtiest cars in the world. We're not moving to electric cars. They're banning electric cars in Scandinavia in 2025. We have no electric vehicle policy. It's insane. We've got this loose target for net zero by 2050, but we've got no action plan to get us there. And at the same time, we're opening new oil fields and coal mines and enormous new gas developments. And these are absolutely inconsistent things. We can't have both. We can't have our cake and eat it too on these. The only way we're going to get to net zero by 2050, and actually we need to get there by something like 2035, is if we stop all the new developments, wind down the old ones, and ramp up solar, wind, and then the newer technologies, geothermal and tidal, which are going to be taking over as well. And we can do this, but we also have to realise that the plan that we've got just now relies on technology that doesn't even exist. I mean, it's insane. Our plan is not a plan. It's a white surrender flag. But we have huge renewable potential resources here in Australia, and we want to be at the front of the pack, not the back. And this is a complete failure of politics. So I'm going to call out the greenwashing and the spin. We are at the back of the pack, and we need to move rapidly ahead. We have the power and the responsibility to do so as a developed nation.
I think you're right. And then, you hear about, another topical story, the AGL proposed takeover by Mike Cannon-Brookes. That shut the whole thing down, moved over to renewables very, very quickly. And then the shareholders.
I'm a huge fan.
Yeah, the way to go is to double down on it. And in fact, more cynically than that, even, it's to split the company into two and hide the coal away. It's incredible that still goes on. Yeah,
I mean, this week they signed off on another huge coal mine in New South Wales. What are our politicians thinking? 2022, it is literally insane. Yeah. And I hope they get the reward that they fully deserve at the ballot box.
Let's hope so. Thank you very much. Any last comments, hopes, dreams, anything?
Just wanted to say to everyone else stepping up there, not turning their face away, I salute you. I salute your courage. You are going to make the difference. We are going to win this. It is far too important a fight not to win. Thank you very much for listening.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much. And Dr. Carolyn Orr, everybody.